And I think now a great segue, Bob, thank you for those comments. Over to Elisa.
Okay, let me get myself going here. Hello. Bob, I think, created expectations I can't meet. So I'm just gonna, and I wanna give a little shout out to the technologists who created Zoom, because I was grateful a couple times that I could both mute and black out my video, because there are a couple things that happened in that conversation that made me break out laughing or make others some appreciative noise. And it was very helpful that I could do that privately. I am going to share my screen now.
You know, that's very cheeky of you, Professor
Cheeky of
Graff.
me.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm enjoying this continuous interaction. So go ahead.
Yeah, let me get back here. Okay, so I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to share my screen. You're going to have to walk me through that. But Katina asked me if I would talk about PIT and global challenges, which is really a pretty interesting question. And so the approach I took here is to get kind of broad, you know, to really talk a little bit more, and we only have a few minutes, so I'm doing it in a really coarse way, but to talk a little bit about how broad is this scope, you know, and how to think about the sorts of issues and challenges that justifiably can be brought into the realm of PIT. And it is in fact, really quite broad. So I want to talk about that a little bit, and then give just a little smidge of an introduction to the way one might think about the relationship of PIT to some of the broader issues that Bob and Eric both talked about, but I'm going to give a much more dumbed down version of it at the moment. And then talk just a little bit about some of the issues that I expect are probably going to be coming up a lot in our program with the students that are likely to be the first cohort, and the kinds of things that seem to be kind of popping right now. And then end by just talking a little bit about some of the things I'm working on, just to illustrate some aspects of some of the dynamics that we're discussing here in this conversation. So, all right. Okay. So public interest technology and global challenges. So unfortunately, I forgot that Zoom does this. You're not going to be able to see that little graphic. All that little graphic shows is that even issues that we think of as global are never just global. So no matter what the issue is, there is always a multi-scalar sort of, there are multi-scalar dimensions to them. There are local, national, regional, and global issues, scales these issues. And I just listed out a bunch of them. We can make that list a lot longer if we did a little bit of brainstorming over a few minutes. But let me kind of just pick up on maybe some that weren't mentioned. I'll skitter around a little bit. I do a lot of work on energy. Energy is definitely a global challenge. What we do with that has multiple dimensions: social, technological, political, and geographical. Geoengineering and carbon dioxide removal, which are kind of their segue issues between energy transitions and climate change, are massively convoluted. They're very wicked problems. I want to talk about that a little bit later on. We don't talk about politics and government very much as being areas where technology and public interest technology matter, but they really do. Bob sort of alluded to it, but I'll get a little bit more explicit. Governments end up collecting a lot of data. How they collect the data, the technologies by which they collect the data, the theories underlying the technologies that they use to collect data, which data, about what kinds of issues, how they store it, how they share it, how they analyze it, what kinds of metrics it turns into. I mean, these are things I did a lot when I was in government, and they're very deeply rooted in a lot of the kinds of concepts that we're talking about with PIT. Other things like how we vote. Voting is a very, very technologically intensive activity. If there is ever a sort of a technological realm where we care about the public interest and how to define it and try to identify who the technologists are, what processes we use to regulate those things, can't think of one that's more timely than elections and voting. Biodiversity is a huge issue, both in terms of the effects of technology and sort of implications of biodiversity for the kinds of technologies that we might create, health, disasters, where we live, the clothes we wear. I mean, think about this. We have a lot of synthetic textiles right now. They're fabulous. They're really fabulous. They're implicated in microplastics that are in the ocean, right? So there are all these you know, there's really nothing about how we live that doesn't have a technological component to it one way or another. So Pitt has no beginning, no end. The boundaries are as wide as you want to make them. And the question is what we do once we bring them into that scope. So this is my super dumbed down version of a much more complicated conversation. And Eric spoke to this a little bit, Bob spoke to this a little bit. There's a really complex ecosystem within which all technology development, science technology policy occurs. All market innovations, all coding, it all occurs in a large ecosystem that involve scientific and policy and sociocultural elements, right? I'm kind of lumping markets into that a little bit. I'm an economist and a political scientist, so I get to do that. These things all kind of come through their own threads, but they do integrate. They integrate into different frames for how we think about the problems that we're worried about, the kinds of solutions that we might consider taking with regard to them, and who's involved in all of those things. Pitt is itself a frame. So just this conception that the way we think about technology needs to be sort of re-articulated to kind of incorporate this notion of a public interest. Eric talked a lot actually, in a really helpful way about trying to articulate who's involved in those conversations, who is and is not a technologist, what are the means by which, and the ideas by which they should, ought to, or can get involved in conversations together. What kinds of implications do they have for the way we actually do things? If you move to the kind of I want a pointer, which I can't really use on the screen, but if you slide over to the gear part of this little diagram, the way we frame issues has a lot to do with the way policies are developed, the way markets form, the way we think about inventions, the way culture evolves, the way the rules are designed, the kinds of social practices that we end up adopting and perpetuating. And there was, of course, a dynamic interaction between and among them, right? So, but these things are all operating sort of in the same space, and we can't really lose track of that. In our at ASU, among the faculty that are in the Pitt program, just those of us that are here on this call today, we have really different backgrounds. So I'm a social scientist with an economics and policy background. Bob told you about his background. Kat has an information technology background. Mahmoud can tell you about his background, you know, when he gets on. We have everybody. We have engineers, natural scientists, physical scientists, lawyers, and we all have a slightly different perspective. Because of my own background and my career, I spent a lot of time at the science policy interface, thinking a lot about how that works and, you know, what makes it work well, what makes it work poorly, who's there, what theories apply, what practices apply, all kind of in the service of trying to figure out how you solve problems of social consequence in a way that really that works. I'm just going to put it like that. And of course, how you define works is a fairly big deal. So what are some of the issues that seem to be emerging as global challenges that Pitt might have something to do with here in the near future? And interestingly, several of them already came up in this conversation. To the far left is a picture of Deepwater Horizon that Bob talked about. I was actually working at Interior when Deepwater Horizon happened. Marcia McNutt was my director. And we all thought, everybody in government who did anything that had to do with water or energy or really anything environmental and scientific, we thought that the entire remainder of our careers were going to go into whatever happened after Deepwater Horizon. Nobody was more surprised than people in government that it kind of got resolved the way it did and that we kind of moved on from that. But we never really did move on entirely because one of the things that happened there's technology assessment and there's risk assessment. One of the things that happened with Deepwater Horizon, which was really significant in terms of how we think about technology going forward, is that in industries like this, the risk of a disaster is typically analyzed, assessed through an economic lens, through a management lens. So let's just say you do something wrong and you have a fine. Can you afford it? Let's just say you do something wrong and you mess things up. Can you clean it up? Can you fix it? Deepwater Horizon was distinctive because there was a legal decision that labeled, that determined that the companies involved in that were grossly negligent. A determination that had never applied before under the Clean Water Act. And it meant that the fines that they faced were a lot bigger than what they were expecting and what has historically been levied in accidents. So those sorts of events actually change, they are other pivot points, they change the way people think about assessment going forward. They change the way they think about risk. They can change who gets involved in the conversations because they have to avoid this sort of an outcome, in the future. Other things that are going on in this space, obviously the COVID pandemic. This is a really complicated issue for us because it was initially regarded as a health issue, and it's obviously still a health issue. But it's become really apparent that it's also an economic issue, that it's a public management issue, that it's a psychology issue, that it's a political issue, and how to develop structural approaches to that, to solve that problem that can integrate all those things. Even something as simple as testing. You can't even think about how to do testing properly unless you take all of those other elements that I just mentioned into account. Because you have to know what you're testing for, and what you're testing for and who you're testing walks you back into the kind of test you need, right? Ideally, and then in practice, who's going to administer them, who's going to report on them, what do people do after they get tested? There are like a whole string of questions that go along with that. And it turns out that we don't really have particularly good processes or mechanisms for being able to have that inclusive conversation. It's potentially the kind of thing that Pitt can create an environment for being able to develop, but I wish we had this now. And it's super tricky. Another aspect of it, we ask who are the technologists. That's another way of asking who are the legitimate stakeholders or the legitimate participants in the conversation. We always have this problem of sort of determining who's in and who's out. With COVID for a long time, I don't know how many of you were involved in this issue at all, but there was a kind of an underlying discourse about, everybody's an epidemiologist now. So there was some pushback to the recognition that it was a broad issue and needed to include more perspectives than just health perspectives. Because it made things much more complicated. We didn't have Eric's STIR process to help us figure out how to approach COVID. But we actually need something like that, now. This slide is, this is a really quick distillation of some work I've been doing for a while, trying to figure out how you deal with the intersection of climate change and energy with a social context, kind of surrounding it with policy context, where instead of thinking about every single thing that we might do related to climate change as its own little technical silo, which is how we deal with it culturally, scientifically, and policy-wise, that we realize that things we do for mitigation and energy transitions, things we do to build resilience and adaptation capacity, and things that we do that might directly intervene in the climate, either through geoengineering or through removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, are actually part of the same policy choice set. So that's not how we structure them, and it's not how we, normally fund them or think about them or even meet in workshops and conferences. But it absolutely is the way we have to be thinking about things if we're going to solve the overall problem. So this is an example of the kinds of questions you ask, the way you frame the technology issue will determine who's involved, how you have those conversations, and the kinds of solutions that come out of them. I'm going to just touch briefly on a project I've been doing for a while that's in the energy transition space. And this is the only example I'll really give of, Bob mentioned that Mahmoud and I both work on questions about participatory solutions and kind of inclusive things. The SEEK project is something that came out of work I was doing with faith communities who have a strong interest in climate change and climate action, and typically very low levels of, if you want to call it, technological or scientific literacy. And so they were asking, they're asking us as a university for impartial assistance, helping them sort of figure things out. Out of it grew a couple of different projects, but the SEEK project has turned out to be in some ways, the one that has the potential to be the biggest. So what we've been doing is working with faith communities all over the country and potentially internationally, to understand that in order to make a difference, they have to kind of know their starting point and then be able to figure out, how the changes that they're making can measurably reflect on the progress they've made from that baseline. Without going into details about it, the theory behind this is the most important and interesting part for Pitt. So the theory behind it is that we normally think about energy transitions as largely hardware sorts of system changes. We think about them mostly as science technology changes with some markets thrown in. But if we actually look at it as a social problem and say, we're talking about some pretty wide scale change, like very, very large scale change, which is essentially societal change. What if we think about that in terms of social values and drivers, social assets and resources, social networks, things that we normally don't think about in terms of the agents for science and technology change? But if we do think about it that way, what kind of projects do we need to run? What kinds of initiatives do we need to develop? What kinds of inclusive mechanisms do we need to design and implement? And this project is based on that. So in practice, what it means is that even though to some degree we're building technological literacy in communities that don't already have it, we're also reflexively, reciprocally building other kinds of literacy into and with other people that are not used to talking with faith communities. They're not used to thinking about justice and ethical issues in the work that they normally do. And we essentially build a platform where we can have that kind of knowledge sharing from a whole bunch of different perspectives and just figure out how to make it work. And we find that the solutions that come out of that are actually quite different than the ones that we might have had otherwise. And really that's all I'm going to say, because I lost my ability to see my clock when I went full screen, and I'm pretty sure I'm over.
That was awesome and right on time, Elisa. Absolutely loving the different scales and views of the world as you see it, and also this coming together of the disciplines, as you mentioned. Also loved your comments on the risk assessment and its sort of relationship with the tech assessment, with the examples. And I can see, given you're a joint appointment, as many of our scholars are, with the School of Sustainability and also the School for the Future of Innovation, how much that's demonstrated in your presentation. But just that one slide with the gears and this life-changing view of things are a social problem, if we could just take that away, whereas we see it as here's the technology and off we go problem, that actually revolutionizes the way we approach those wicked problems that you and Bob actually studied. But I'm just taken aback by your presentation and its depth and breadth.